The mining tunnel groaned like an old animal waking up, and nobody on the crew liked that sound. Daniel Rourke felt it before he heard it, a shiver running through the metal floor plates under his boots. He was halfway through checking a support strut when the groan turned into a crack, sharp and sudden, echoing down the long dark shaft. He did not have time to run. The strut above him buckled, and a slab of rock and steel came down like a fist. Daniel threw himself sideways, but it was not enough. The edge of the collapse caught his legs and pinned him to the ground. Pain exploded through his body, white and blinding, and for a moment the whole world was just noise and dust. Around him, the tunnel filled with shouting. Alien voices, clicking and buzzing in panic, mixed with the groan of settling rock. Daniel blinked through the dust and forced his mind to work. He was an engineer. He had studied structures his whole life. Even now, half buried under a mountain of debris, some part of his brain was already thinking about weight distribution and pressure points. "Do not move the east beam first," he shouted, his voice rough with pain but steady. "It's holding the ceiling. Clear the south side. Slow and careful." The rescue crew, mostly Vantic workers with long limbs and pale blue skin, froze for a second, surprised that the crushed human was giving orders instead of screaming for help. But his voice was clear, and his instructions made sense. They obeyed. It took almost 20 minutes to free him. When they finally pulled the last piece of rock away, Daniel's legs were a ruin, twisted and bloody beneath his torn work suit. He did not look down. He kept his eyes on the tunnel ceiling, watching for more cracks, still thinking like an engineer even as his own body fell apart. They rushed him to the colony's medical bay on a floating stretcher. The lights above him blurred into streaks as they moved fast through the corridors. Alien nurses spoke to each other in urgent tones, running scanners over his broken body. Daniel stayed quiet, breathing through the pain, saving his strength. The head physician, a tall Vantic named Thessa, examined the scans with a deep frown on her long face. She had worked with humans before, but she still found their fragile bodies strange. So much damage from so little force, and yet the human in front of her was barely making a sound. "The spine is shattered in 2 places," she said quietly to her assistant. "The nerve pathways in the lower body are destroyed. Even with our best treatments, this is beyond repair." She turned to Daniel, expecting him to be unconscious or in shock. Instead, his eyes were open, watching her carefully. "Give it to me straight, Doc," he said. "How bad?" Thessa hesitated. In her long career, she had delivered this news many times to many different species. It never got easier. She chose her words carefully, the way she always did. "Daniel, I am sorry. Your spine cannot be repaired with what we have here. The damage is too severe. You will not walk again." The room went quiet. Even the machines seemed to hush for a moment. The nurses exchanged glances, waiting for the human to break down, to cry, to scream, anything. That was what usually happened. Bodies were different across species, but grief looked the same on most faces. Daniel stared at the ceiling for a long moment. His jaw tightened, just slightly. Then he let out a slow breath. "Okay," he said simply. Thessa blinked. "Okay. Yeah." Daniel shifted his shoulders, trying to sit up a little despite the pain shooting through his back. "Not walking. Got it. Noted." He paused, glancing at the small screen beside his bed showing his vital signs. "When can I get access to a terminal? I've got a status report due on the elevator project." The nurses looked at each other, unsure if he understood what had just been said. Thessa leaned closer, speaking slowly, the way she might to someone in shock. "Daniel, do you understand what I told you? Your legs will not work anymore. This is permanent." "I heard you," Daniel said, and there was no anger in his voice, no denial either. Just a strange, calm acceptance. "Legs don't work. That's a problem. I'll figure out how to work around it. But right now, the tunnel supports on level 4 are still weak, and if nobody fixes the load calculations soon, we're going to have a second collapse. So, terminal, please." Thessa did not know what to say. She had expected panic, or maybe deep sadness. She had not expected calm, focused determination, as if losing the use of his legs was simply one more problem to solve on a very long list of problems. She glanced at her assistant, who looked just as confused as she felt. Neither of them had ever seen anything quite like this. Humans, they had heard, were strange and stubborn creatures. Watching Daniel now, Lying broken in a medical bed and already thinking about work schedules, Thessa began to understand just how true that was. "I will have someone bring you a terminal," she said slowly. "But you need rest first. Your body has been through a terrible trauma." "Noted," Daniel said again, closing his eyes. "But the trauma can wait. The tunnel can't." Thessa left the room a few minutes later, deeply unsettled. She had delivered devastating news to countless patients over the years. She had never once had a patient respond by asking for a work terminal. As she walked down the quiet corridor, she found herself wondering what kind of species could take such terrible news and simply decide to keep moving forward, as if nothing could truly stop them at all. Thessa did not sleep well that night. She sat in her small office near the medical bay, staring at Daniel's scan results on her screen, trying to make sense of what she had witnessed. In 30 years of practicing medicine across a dozen different worlds, she had never had a patient react the way he did. Her assistant, a younger Vantic named Doro, knocked softly and stepped inside. "You're still here," he said, glancing at the clock. "It's late." "I keep thinking about the human," Thessa said, not looking away from the screen. "Rourke, the engineer." Doro nodded slowly. "The one who asked for a terminal after you told him he'd never walk again." "Yes." Thessa rubbed her eyes. "Doro, in your studies, did you ever read about human psychology? Their relationship with pain and injury?" Doro sat down across from her, curious. "A little." "What?" "Because I do not think what I saw today was denial," Thessa said. "Denial looks different. Denial is confusion, anger, refusal to accept facts. This was something else. He accepted the facts completely. He simply did not let them stop him." Doro considered this. "I have heard stories," he said carefully, "from workers who came from the mining colony on the outer ring, before they transferred here. There was a human there, a maintenance worker, who broke his arm in 3 places during a storm. Instead of going to the medical bay, he wrapped it himself with tape and cloth and finished repairing a broken generator because the storm was getting worse and people needed power." "What happened to him?" Thessa asked. "He finished the repair. Then he walked to the medical bay on his own, arm still wrapped, and only then let anyone look at it." Doro shook his head. "The other workers said he told them, and I remember this exactly because it confused everyone. The deadline doesn't care about my arm." Thessa let out a long breath. "The deadline doesn't care," she repeated softly. "That is a strange way to think." "Strange to us," Doro said, "but maybe not strange to them. Humans built their entire civilization in a very short amount of time, compared to most species we know. Some of our scholars believe it is because they refuse to stop, even when stopping would make sense to anyone else." Thessa thought about this for a long moment. She had read reports before, official documents about human labor practices, human military history, human sports, and endurance events. She had always found the stories interesting but somewhat exaggerated, the kind of thing that gets bigger every time it is told. Now, having seen it with her own eyes, she was beginning to wonder if the stories were not exaggerated at all. "I worry about him," she admitted finally. "Whether this is truly strength, or whether he is simply unable to process what has happened to him. Sometimes the mind protects itself by refusing to feel pain until much later, and when it finally does feel it, the damage can be worse." "That is possible," Doro agreed. "But there is another possibility too." "What is that?" "That for humans, work itself is a way of processing pain. Not avoiding it, processing it." Doro shrugged. "We will not know unless we watch him closely." Thessa nodded slowly, deciding that this was exactly what she would do. She stood and walked back toward the medical bay to check on her patient one final time before the night shift took over. When she reached Daniel's room, she found him not asleep, but sitting up in bed, a borrowed data pad balanced on his knees, eyes moving quickly across lines of text and numbers. He had convinced one of the night nurses to bring him basic access to the colony network, promising he would only look at engineering reports. "You are supposed to be resting," Thessa said, stepping inside. Daniel glanced up, not even slightly embarrassed. "I am resting. I'm lying down, aren't I?" "That is not what I meant." "I know." He offered a tired smile. "Look, Doc, I appreciate the concern. I really do. But lying here doing nothing is going to drive me crazy faster than any amount of work will. My brain needs something to chew on. Right now, that something is the elevator support system, because if nobody fixes those load calculations, We're looking at a repeat of what put me in this bed in the first place. Thessa studied his face carefully, searching for any sign of the breakdown she still expected to come. She saw exhaustion. She saw pain carefully controlled, but she did not see denial. He understood exactly what had happened to him. He simply refused to let it define what came next. Tomorrow, she said slowly, you will still be here, in this bed. Tomorrow, Daniel replied, I'm going back to work. In whatever chair or device you people have for this sort of thing. I'll be at my desk by morning. Thessa opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. She had a feeling that arguing would accomplish nothing. Instead, she simply nodded and left him to his data pad, walking back through the quiet corridors of the medical bay, more curious about humans than she had ever been in her long career, and more certain than ever that tomorrow was going to be an interesting day. Morning on the colony did not look like morning anywhere on Earth. There was no sun, no sky, only the pale artificial light that slowly brightened along the ceiling panels of every corridor, tricking the body into thinking a new day had begun. For most of the crew, this gentle light was a signal to start moving slowly, grab something to eat, and ease into the day. Daniel Rourke did not ease into anything. He rolled into the command center exactly on time. Seated in a motorized mobility chair, the medical staff had rushed to prepare overnight. A thin blanket covered his legs, still wrapped and healing from the accident. A data pad was balanced across the chair's armrest, and a cup of coffee sat in a cup holder someone had improvised out of spare metal tubing. The room fell silent the moment he entered. Workers of several species turned to look, some openly staring, others trying and failing to pretend they were not. OSRA, the Vantic supervisor who had overseen the mining project and witnessed the accident firsthand, stood near the main console with her mouth slightly open. Rourke, she said slowly, using his surname the way most of the crew did. You were supposed to be resting. Physician Thessa said. Physician Thessa said I'd never walk again. Daniel interrupted, wheeling himself toward his workstation. She didn't say anything about not working. So here I am. Working. OSRA exchanged a glance with a nearby technician. Neither of them knew what to say. On most worlds, an injury like Daniel's would mean months, maybe years, of recovery and mental adjustment before returning to any kind of demanding work. Some cultures considered it disrespectful to even ask an injured worker to return so soon. You do not have to prove anything, OSRA said carefully. No one expects you to be here today. Daniel looked up at her, and for the first time that morning, something like real emotion crossed his face, not sadness, but a kind of quiet stubbornness. I'm not trying to prove anything to anyone else, he said. I'm doing this because sitting in a bed staring at the ceiling is worse than any of this. He gestured vaguely toward his legs. Work is what makes sense to me right now, so let me work. OSRA studied him for a long moment, then finally nodded and stepped aside. Daniel wasted no time getting started. Without the ability to walk the tunnels himself, he shifted his entire approach, pulling up live feeds from drones and wall-mounted cameras scattered throughout the mining site. He directed his team through a headset, his voice calm and clear, guiding them through repairs with the same precision he always had, just from a different vantage point. Camera 3, tilt down 15 degrees, he said, watching the screen closely. There. See that crack running along the support beam? That's what caused yesterday's collapse. If we don't reinforce that entire section, we're looking at the same problem in a different spot next week. The team on the ground followed his instructions, moving carefully through the damaged tunnel while Daniel watched from the safety of the command center. It should have felt strange, directing dangerous physical work from a chair, unable to move his own legs. Instead, it felt oddly natural to him, like his mind had simply found a new way to do the same job. A young alien technician named Vashi, still new to the crew, approached his station nervously around midday. Sir, she said, I wanted to ask, are you certain you should be here? After what happened? Daniel paused his work and looked at her, softening his tone. I appreciate you asking. Really, but I'm not made of glass, Vashi. My legs don't work right now, sure. That's a real problem. But my brain still works fine, and this job needs my brain a lot more than it needs my legs. So don't treat me any differently than you would have yesterday. Just help me get this done. Vashi nodded, looking relieved, and returned to her station without further hesitation. By early afternoon, Daniel had reviewed nearly every structural report from the mining site, cross-checking them against sensor data from the drones. Something in the numbers bothered him, a small inconsistency he could not quite place at first. He leaned closer to his screen, running calculation after calculation, ignoring the ache spreading through his back from sitting too long. Then he found it. "OSRA," he called out, waving her over. "Come look at this." She crossed the room quickly, leaning over his shoulder to study the numbers on his screen. "What am I looking at?" "The support strut that collapsed yesterday. It wasn't a random failure," Daniel explained. "The original design calculations were off by a small margin, small enough that nobody caught it during inspection, but big enough that under the right pressure, it would eventually fail. And there are at least 6 more struts across the site built to the exact same specifications." OSRA's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "You are saying there are more collapses coming?" "I'm saying there will be, if we don't fix the design flaw across the entire network before it happens again." Daniel pulled up a revised set of calculations he had already begun preparing. "I've got a fix. It'll take extra material and about 2 days of reinforcement work, but it'll stop this from happening to anyone else." OSRA stared at him, then at the screen, then back at him again. Just one day after being told he would never walk again, Daniel had not only returned to work, he had found the exact flaw that nearly killed him and was already solving it before it could hurt anyone else. "You truly are a strange species," she said quietly, though there was no longer any doubt or pity in her voice, only something close to respect. Daniel simply smiled and went back to his calculations, already thinking about the next problem waiting to be solved. News traveled fast on a colony where everyone lived and worked close together. But the story of the human engineer who returned to work one day after being told he would never walk again traveled faster than most. Within a week, it had spread far beyond the mining site, reaching administrative offices, other colonies in the sector, and eventually the desk of a sector official named Counselor Vren. Vren was not an easy person to impress. He had spent decades managing labor policies across a dozen different colonies, and he had seen every kind of worker, from the hardest laborers to the most reluctant. When his assistant first told him about Daniel Rourke, he assumed it was an exaggeration, the kind of story that grows bigger with each retelling. A human with a shattered spine returned to full duty the next day? Vren repeated skeptically, reading through the report on his screen. "That seems unlikely or unwise." "The medical records confirm it, sir," his assistant said. "Physician Thessa personally verified his condition. He truly cannot walk. Yet his work output over the past week has actually increased compared to before his injury." Vren frowned deeply. In his experience, injuries like this were treated with great caution, both for the workers' physical health and their mental well-being. Rushing back to demanding work after such trauma seemed reckless, potentially even dangerous, not just for the human himself, but for the standard it might set for other workers across the sector. "This concerns me," Vren said. "If word spreads that an employer can expect this level of recovery and output from injured workers, other species may feel pressured to do the same, regardless of whether it is healthy for them to do so." He ordered a formal review, both of Daniel's specific situation and of human labor practices more broadly. Within days, Daniel found himself called before a small review panel, seated once again in his mobility chair, data pad in hand, as always. The panel room was cold and formal, with several officials seated behind a long, curved desk, Vren at the center. OSRA sat nearby as a witness, along with Thessa, both looking slightly uneasy about the proceedings. "Mr. Rourke," Vren began, his tone carefully neutral, "we have called this review because your recovery, or rather your return to work despite lack of recovery, raises certain concerns. We want to understand your reasoning and ensure that no one, including yourself, is being placed at unnecessary risk." Daniel nodded calmly, not the slightest bit intimidated by the formal setting. "I appreciate you looking into this, Counselor. Ask whatever you need to ask." "Very well." Vren glanced down at his notes. "Do you feel you were pressured, by your supervisors or by workplace culture, to return to duty before you were mentally or physically prepared?" "No," Daniel said simply. "Nobody pressured me. If anything, my supervisor and my doctor both told me to slow down. I made the choice myself." "And why did you make that choice?" Vren pressed. Most beings, after suffering an injury of this severity, would need significant time to process the trauma before resuming demanding responsibilities. Daniel considered the question carefully before answering. Because sitting still and doing nothing was worse for me than working. My body is broken, counselor. That's true, and I'm not pretending otherwise. But my mind isn't broken. My skills aren't broken. The work I do doesn't require my legs. It requires my brain, and my brain is exactly as sharp as it was before the accident. Taking that away from me, telling me to just sit and wait and heal, that wouldn't have helped me. It would have made things worse. Vren studied him for a long moment, clearly unconvinced but willing to listen further. Let us look at the practical results, then. He gestured to a screen showing Daniel's production data since the accident. Your team's output has increased by nearly 12% since you resumed duty. You identified and corrected a structural flaw that likely prevented at least one additional collapse. Your morale reports from your team members are, frankly, higher than they were before your injury. People work better when they trust their leader isn't going to disappear on them the moment things get hard, Daniel said. I think that trust matters more than most people realize. One of the other panel members, an older alien with silver markings across her face, leaned forward. Do you believe your experience should set a standard for other injured workers, human or otherwise? Daniel shook his head firmly. No, absolutely not. This isn't about setting a standard. This is about me, personally, choosing what works for me. Everyone processes pain and loss differently. Some people need rest, and that's completely valid. I need purpose. Please don't turn my choice into some kind of expectation for other people. That wouldn't be fair to anyone. Vren seemed to consider this response carefully, some of the tension leaving his posture. He glanced at Thessa. Physician, in your professional opinion, is Mr. Rourke suffering from any form of denial or psychological avoidance regarding his condition? Thessa shook her head slowly. I suspected that myself, at first. But after observing him closely over the past week, I do not believe that is the case. He has fully acknowledged the permanence of his condition. He simply refuses to let it define his capabilities. The panel exchanged quiet glances. After a brief private discussion, Vren addressed Daniel one final time. We will not be issuing any formal restrictions regarding your work status, Mr. Rourke. However, we will be closely monitoring your well-being going forward, purely as a precaution. That's fair, Daniel said, nodding. Can I get back to work now? We've got a support beam reinforcement scheduled for this afternoon, and I'd like to review the plans before it starts. Vren allowed himself the faintest hint of a smile, something rare for him. You may go, Mr. Rourke. As Daniel wheeled himself out of the room, Vren remained seated, staring thoughtfully at the closed door. He had reviewed countless labor cases in his career, but none quite like this one. There was something unsettling, and yet strangely admirable, about a species that refused to let broken bodies mean broken purpose. He made a quiet note to keep a closer eye on human workers going forward, not out of suspicion, but out of genuine curiosity about what else they might be capable of. 3 weeks after the review panel cleared him to keep working, Daniel had settled into a new rhythm. His mornings began the same way every day, arriving at the command center early, coffee in hand, ready to direct the ongoing reinforcement of the tunnel network. The crew had grown used to seeing him in his chair, no longer whispering about it, simply treating him as they always had, as their engineer. That rhythm broke apart on a Tuesday, without any warning at all. An alarm tore through the command center, sharp and urgent, followed immediately by a wave of red warning lights across every screen. Daniel's hands moved instantly to his console, pulling up diagnostic feeds before anyone else in the room had even fully registered what was happening. Pressure breach, he said, his voice cutting through the rising panic around him. Section 7, near the main elevator shaft. It's spreading fast. OSRA rushed to his side, her communicator already buzzing with frantic reports from the field. The support network is failing, she said, reading the incoming messages quickly. Multiple bulkheads are not responding to remote commands. We have workers trapped on the far side of the breach. Daniel's eyes moved rapidly across his screens, processing the failing systems, the trapped locations, the spreading pressure loss. Most of the senior engineers who understood the elevator's failsafe systems were either off duty or, worse, trapped on the wrong side of the breach themselves. I know this system, Daniel said, already pulling up the emergency override protocols. I built half of these failsafes myself. OSRA, I need full control access now. OSRA did not hesitate. Granted, do whatever you need to do. Daniel's hands flew across his console, rerouting power, sealing what bulkheads still responded, and pulling up drone feeds from every corner of the affected section. Chaos filled his screens, flashing warnings, dropping pressure readings, and the frightened voices of trapped workers coming through the comm system. Among those voices was Vashi, the young technician who had once nervously asked if he should really be working. She was trapped near a damaged power conduit, her voice shaking as she spoke through her headset. I can't get the backup bulkhead to close, she said, panic rising with every word. The controls aren't responding, and the pressure keeps dropping. Vashi, listen to me. Daniel's voice remained perfectly steady, cutting through her fear like a calm hand on a shaking shoulder. I need you to stay where you are and breathe. Can you see a secondary panel near your position, small, gray, with a manual override switch? There was a pause, filled with the sound of her ragged breathing. Yes, I see it. Good. That panel controls a manual power reroute. I'm going to walk you through this step by step, and I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that? Yes, Vashi said, her voice steadying slightly, anchored by the calm confidence in his tone. Okay, first, open the panel and look for 3 colored wires, red, blue, and yellow. Daniel guided her carefully through the process, describing each step in simple, clear instructions, never rushing her, never showing even a hint of the pressure he must have felt watching pressure levels continue to drop across the section. Around him, the command center buzzed with activity, other workers handling different parts of the crisis, but every few moments, eyes flicked toward Daniel, drawing confidence from his steady presence. Connect the yellow wire to the secondary terminal, he continued. You'll feel a small click when it's seated properly. A pause. Then, I felt it. I felt the click. Perfect. Now flip the switch beside it. Another pause, longer this time, filled with tense silence throughout the command center. Then Vashi's voice came through again, filled with relief. The bulkhead is closing. It's sealing. Cheers erupted quietly through the command center, though Daniel did not pause to celebrate. Already moving on to the next trapped section, the next failing bulkhead, guiding rescue drones through narrow corridors to reach stranded workers. For nearly 2 hours, he coordinated the entire emergency response from his chair, never once raising his voice, never once showing panic, simply working through each problem with the same calm focus he brought to everything else. By the time the pressure breach was fully contained and every trapped worker accounted for, the command center was quiet again, the red warning lights finally fading back to a steady green. Daniel leaned back in his chair, allowing himself, for the first time in hours, to feel the exhaustion settling into his shoulders. OSRA approached slowly, her expression difficult to read. She had spent 2 hours watching him work without pause, without complaint, guiding dozens of frightened workers to safety using nothing but calm words and quick thinking. You saved them, she said quietly. All of them. Because you knew the system better than anyone else, and because you never stopped believing you could fix it. Daniel wiped a hand across his tired face, offering a small, weary smile. Just doing my job, OSRA. She studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes. Finally, she asked the question that had been sitting in the back of her mind since the day he first returned to work. How, Daniel? How does someone go through what you went through, lose the use of their own legs, and still find the strength to do all of this? Your body failed you completely, and still you did not stop. Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering the question more seriously than he usually allowed himself to. Honestly, he said finally, I don't fully know how to answer that. I think humans just don't like the idea of stopping, even when our bodies tell us to. Especially when our bodies tell us to. He shrugged slightly. Maybe that's not always healthy. But today, I think it helped. OSRA nodded slowly, the question still lingering in her mind long after their conversation ended, unable to fully understand it, but deeply, quietly grateful for it all the same. The colony held a small gathering 2 days after the pressure breach was fully repaired, nothing large or formal, just a simple room filled with workers who wanted to properly thank the man who had guided so many of them to safety. Daniel had tried to talk his way out of attending, insisting there was still work to be done, but OSRA had refused to take no for an answer this time. For 1 hour, she had told him, you will let people say thank you without arguing. Daniel sat near the front of the room in his chair, looking slightly uncomfortable with the attention as workers from different departments came up one by one to shake his hand or offer quiet words of gratitude. Vashi was among them, her earlier nervousness completely gone, replaced by a warm, genuine smile. I wanted to say thank you properly, she said. Not just for the rescue. For not treating me differently after the accident. You could have assigned someone else to walk me through that repair. Someone who could actually reach the site in person. But you trusted me to do it myself. You did do it yourself, Daniel said. I just talked you through it. That's not nothing, Vashi replied firmly, before returning to her seat. Later, as the gathering wound down, Thessa approached Daniel's chair, holding a data pad of her own. I have something for you, she said. News, actually. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Good news or bad news? Good, I believe. Thessa handed him the data pad. Human medical researchers on Earth have made significant progress with neural interface technology, specifically designed to help patients with spinal injuries regain mobility. The early trials have been remarkably successful. I have been in contact with their research team, and they believe you would be an excellent candidate for the program. Daniel stared at the screen, reading through the details slowly, carefully, as if afraid the words might change if he looked away. You're saying I could walk again? Within the year, if all continues to go well, Thessa said. It would not be like it was before. You would need training, adjustment, powered leg braces connected directly to your nervous system. But yes, Daniel, you could walk again. For a long moment, Daniel said nothing at all, simply staring at the screen in his hands. Then he let out a slow breath, something between a laugh and quiet disbelief. Well, he said finally, guess I better start clearing my schedule. Thessa smiled, one of the rare full smiles she allowed herself. I thought you might say something like that. Months passed after that conversation, filled with long-distance communication with the research team back on Earth, careful medical preparations, and grueling training sessions once the equipment finally arrived at the colony. Daniel never spoke much about the difficulty of it, the frustration of relearning something as simple as standing, but OSRA noticed the quiet determination in his eyes every single day, the same determination she had first seen the morning after his accident. Then, one ordinary morning, nothing seemed different at all. The pale artificial light brightened slowly along the command center ceiling. Workers arrived for their shifts, drinking their morning coffee, checking overnight reports. Everything felt exactly the same as it had for months. Until Daniel walked in. He moved slowly, carefully, powered braces humming softly with each measured step, one hand resting lightly against the wall for balance. He did not announce his arrival, did not make any kind of speech or grand gesture. He simply walked to his usual station, the same station he had worked from in his chair for so many months, and settled into his seat as if nothing unusual had happened at all. The room fell completely silent. Every worker present turned to stare, disbelief written clearly across faces of a dozen different species. Vashi nearly dropped the data pad she was holding. OSRA, standing near the main console, simply stood frozen, watching him with wide eyes. Daniel glanced up, noticing the silence, and offered a small, almost embarrassed smile. What, he said. We've got a briefing to start. Section 9's reinforcement schedule isn't going to review itself. Slowly, quietly, the room began to move again, workers returning to their stations, though many continued glancing toward Daniel throughout the morning, still processing what they had just witnessed. OSRA crossed the room and stood beside his station, watching him pull up the morning reports exactly as he always had. You could have told someone, she said. Given us some warning. Daniel shrugged, focused on his screen. Didn't seem necessary. Figured I'd just show up and get back to work. Seemed to work out pretty well the first time. OSRA studied him for a long moment, thinking back to that very first morning, the human who had been told he would never walk again, only to return to his desk the very next day, refusing to let a broken body define what he could still accomplish. She thought about the review panel, the pressure breach, the countless small moments since then where Daniel had simply kept working, kept solving problems, kept moving forward no matter what stood in his way. For so long, Her species had measured strength by physical wholeness, by the ability of a body to endure and perform. Watching Daniel now, standing on legs that had been rebuilt through sheer human stubbornness and modern science combined, she finally understood that humanity measured strength differently. Not by what their bodies could do, but by what they will refuse to let stop. She said nothing more, simply returning to her own station as the morning briefing began, Daniel's steady voice filling the room once again, exactly as it always had, exactly as it always would.